Welcome to Realcast, the weekly roundup of the real asset markets. My name's Richard Betts, and I'm joined this week by Richard Stevens and Paul Strome. Paul, let's start with you. What are your kind of key stories of the week?
Well, in the first week of COP26, there was no shortage of ESG-related stories, but one in particular that we picked up on was Nordic property investor NREP's commitment to being carbon neutral by 2028, which it claims would make it the first international real estate investor with a carbon neutral investment portfolio, as well as being ahead of the IPCC's target date of net zero by 2050. The company stated that its goal includes both operational and embodied carbon, and that the target will be achieved without using carbon offsets. NREP, which is headquartered in Copenhagen, does have a track record of sustainable development, and initiatives include the largest rooftop solar plant in the Nordics, the use of embodied carbon concrete, geothermal heating, the world's first 100% upcycled concrete building, and UN 17 Village, the first large-scale project to align with all of the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The company recently announced the final close of Sustainability Technology Fund 2150 at 268 million euros, the first 5 investments of which have the potential to mitigate over 1.6 gigatons of CO2 emissions. CEO Klaus Matheson says that to achieve these ambitious targets, many technologies need to be deployed in parallel and at scale. He says it has been hugely encouraging to see the sector galvanise ahead of COP26, but adds that pledges alone aren't enough. Substantially more decisive action is needed. And then last week we published the second edition of Real Asset Impact. That coincided with COP26 as it's such a relevant publication. And we got interviews there with Sarah Gordon, CEO of the Impact Investing Institute, Clemens Brenninkmeyer of Redevco, Susan Aitken, leader of Glasgow City Council, a piece on making the office safer in the context of COVID-19, another on diversity in real estate. There's a profile of Home REIT. Rather crucially, Sarah Gordon makes the point that impact investing is not philanthropy. It's a commercially based activity with wider objectives. Lastly, we mentioned that the US-Canada version of Emerging Trends in Real Estate a while back. Last week, Emerging Trends Europe was published. Again, a detailed and wide-ranging survey of opinion in the industry, but just to pick up on a couple of points, Emerging Trends is a sentiment survey. It gathered responses from 844 European real estate sector leaders, and found that although business confidence within the real estate sector in Europe has reached its highest level since 2014, 68% of real estate leaders perceive a need to transform their organisations over the next 3 to 5 years. Some of that, of course, has to do with ESG and responding to changes brought on by COVID. On the future of offices, 85% now expect a lasting increase in time worked remotely, and 74% see a growing valuation gap between primary and secondary offices. The report also revealed that London comes top overall for investment development prospects in European city rankings, and that's ahead of second place Berlin, reversing last year's top 2 positions, with Paris remaining third place. The report found that the UK capital benefits from the depth of its market and its gateway status, and a widely perceived yield gap of around 1% between London offices and their continental equivalent, which gives it an advantage in terms of value for money.
It was interesting to see the city placement there, and also I think in terms of the European survey, the sort of positive view that you could see coming through, but would have been interesting also just in terms of that, in terms of the research gathering, given the view changing over the year. Also interesting, you mentioned there about NREP. Obviously, they've recently announced a 500 million investment plan into both resi and logistics in CEE, Richard. So interesting to get your take on, I suppose, what you're seeing at the moment in the CEE markets and Poland.
Yeah, I mean, with COP26 happening, everything, Poland is obviously very much a coal industry, in the past. So there's a lot of talk about converting to renewable energy. And it kind of chimes in with ESG. This is the big topic of conversation. All the conferences are talking about it. I think that in Poland and Central Eastern Europe, it's kind of unknown quantity. I know that in Western Europe, it's more established. In Poland, it's really only the international business community who's talking about it. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that comes in. As you say, NREP have come in. They announced in June the 500 million euro investment in real estate, in residential and logistics. And that's really interesting because, people in Poland tend to think that most big Western developers or investors who are going to come into Poland have already come. So it's quite a nice thing to see such a major Scandinavian investor coming in. And it's the private rental sector, more and more, as the office market, people are watching what's happening. Retail, we know with the lockdowns, etc., it's been difficult. Everyone knows that logistics and warehouses is steaming ahead with lots of activity there. So it's the private rental sector which people are watching, and some deals have been made, but so far, it's hard to gauge what really is the appetite amongst the Polish residents buying public to see if they really do have an appetite for renting on the large scale that's needed for the market to go ahead. I think the political backdrop is a concern. People don't really want to talk about it, but there's been a lot of saber rattling with the European Union, and the Polish government has taken it to quite an extreme by defying European Union about the European Court. And in Czech Republic, there's been a recent election. There's going to be an election coming up in Hungary. So Central Eastern Europe is several countries, obviously. So there's always some political changes happening. But certainly this is on everyone's mind. And I think investors are a little bit worried. In Q3, 1.4 billion has transacted, which is about 30% higher than last year. Most of the office transactions have been in Warsaw. It's down in the regional cities. Industrial keeps going very strong.
Yes, it's interesting. That view in terms of ESG in the CE markets. I also noticed, interestingly, because retail has taken a battering in terms of investor intentions and was a long way down as well on the list in terms of the ULI trends. But I noticed actually that Patron Capital had signed a JV with Try, 140 million to accelerate Polish expansion there in retail parks. I thought that was an interesting one to see in your area, Richard.
Retail parks seem to have been bucking the trend a little bit. Is shopping centres which are having the difficulty, but these sort of out of centre just outside the suburbs on the edge of the big cities, these slightly discounted retail parks seem to be doing very well and are always very full. In fact, a friend of mine tried to go recently just outside Warsaw and couldn't get a parking space. So it's not like the whole of retail has been on hold. People are very much buying in certain subsectors.
That's interesting. And that focus on retail parks also comes through in the ULI report. I noticed as well, Paul, picking up on your point about London, Montrose Land, a new £500 million Asian-backed vehicle buying its first London asset. And of course, infrastructure has also been a huge story this week with the passage of US President Joe Biden's $1 trillion infrastructure spending package, which includes obviously the modernisation of city transport systems. And this is a topic which also influences the real asset markets. And we'll pick this up in our event looking at transport infrastructure and logistics on Tuesday. COP26 moves into its second week and we'll be at COP with Impact Magazine hosting, along with the city of Glasgow, an event focused on sustainable investment opportunities in cities on the 11th of November, which is the day designated for cities, regions and the built environment. You can join the live stream for both events as usual through the RealX auditorium, and I'll report back on COP26 in next week's Realcast. Thanks very much, Richard and Paul. Thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you next week for our regular roundup of the real asset markets.